There's a kind of man the frontier produces and then pretends it didn't. He rides in with no story you can verify, no family anyone can name, a horse worth more than his boots and a silence worth more than the horse. The town decides what he is inside an hour. Drifter, hired gun, trouble looking for a place to rest. I'm Holly's Prout, and I have been wrong about exactly one man in my 61 years, and I was wrong about him on purpose, because being right would have cost me something I wasn't ready to spend. They told her it was only temporary, 90 days, a signature, a roof, a name on a piece of territory paper, and then he'd take his wages and be gone before the first frost. That was the arrangement, agreed to in plain words by every soul who mattered, including the two who shook hands on it. I wrote the date in my tally book. I figured I'd cross it out come fall. I never crossed it out. What that cowboy did on the 89th day put a banker on his heels, put a rope back in its saddlebag, and put a kind of quiet over this whole valley that we still don't have the right word for. Some folks call it foolishness. The Apache family up at the Cold Spring have their own name for it, and they don't share it with people like me. So sit close. This is the story of a promise nobody believed in, least of all the man who made it. Stay through all 3 parts, because the thing that matters doesn't happen at the start. It almost never does. The day they got married, I was holding a horse that didn't want holding, and I remember thinking that was the most honest thing happening on the whole property. The bay mare tossed her head and stamped, and I worked the bent nail I keep in my coat pocket, old habit, an old foreman's worry stone, back and forth across my knuckles, while the preacher mumbled words none of them meant. 40 feet off, on the porch of the Mercer ranch house, Della Mercer stood in a gray dress that had been her mother's, and the drifter stood beside her in a borrowed coat, and Mr. Coyle from the bank stood off to the side with his hat in his hands and his ledger in his eyes. You want to know how a thing like this happens? I'll tell you the way I came to understand it, which is slow, because nobody explains anything to the hired help. We just stand close and add it up. Della's husband, Tom Mercer, had been dead 11 months, thrown from a green colt into a dry wash, neck broke before sundown, and the only mercy in it was that it was quick. Tom and I had built that ranch out of mesquite and stubbornness over 14 years. I'd buried his father. I figured I'd be buried before I buried him. The frontier doesn't care what you figure. What Tom left behind was a wife with more grit than the county deserved, and a clause in a homestead patent that no grieving woman should have to read. The proving up on the lower section, the part with the Cold Spring, the part worth fighting over, sat under Tom's name, and the territorial agent, a soft man named Pelham with damp hands, took one look at a widow running cattle alone and decided the claim had lapsed in its conditions of continuous improvement by the patentee. Big words for a small theft. Translated, it meant, a woman alone can't hold it, a man has to. And waiting in the wings, hat already half off in anticipation, was Royce Holt. Holt ran the bar cross to our north, 11,000 acres of the kind of grass that makes a man's voice get gentle right before he ruins you. He'd offered to buy Della out 3 times. The third offer came with a sentence about how dangerous it was. A woman out here, all these elements about. He said elements and let his eyes drift north toward the spring, toward the Apache family that wintered there, and I watched Della's jaw set like a fence post going into caliche. She didn't sell. Instead, she did the one thing that made the whole county talk for a month. She put up a notice in the Mercantile, and then she did her own arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, I need a husband by the agent's deadline or I lose the lower section, and I will not be ruined into Royce Holt's bed of grass. So she went looking for a man the way you'd go looking for a draft animal, useful, temporary, returnable. The drifter came in answer to that notice. His name, he said, was Asab Boone. I didn't believe Boone was the whole of it, and I still don't, but a man's allowed his own measure of how much name he hands out. He'd come up from the south with a good gray gelding, a saddle that had seen real work, a rifle he cleaned every evening whether he'd fired it or not, and a way of looking at a place that took inventory without seeming to. First thing he did when he rode in, before he'd said 3 words to Della, he crouched at the corral and put his hand flat on the ground and felt the dirt like he was taking its pulse. Second thing he did was notice the busted hinge on the tack room door and fix it without being asked, with a nail he had in his own pocket. I noticed that. I noticed nails. The terms were laid out plain at the kitchen table, with me there because Della wanted a witness who could write and coil there, because the bank held the note on the upper pasture, and wanted to know what its money was standing on. 90 days. Asa would live in the bunkhouse, not the house. Della was clear as cold water on that, and he didn't blink at it. He'd put his name on the marriage paper, and the amended patent so the claim held continuous and male, satisfy the soft-handed agent, and work the place like a hand. At the end of 90 days, after the agent's autumn inspection cleared the claim into Della's secure title, they'd file the dissolution papers the lawyer in Tucson had already half-drawn. Asa would take $80 and the gray's worth of feed and he'd ride. The land would be hers. Clean. Done. You understand, Coyle said to him in that careful banker way, that you'll have no claim. None. Your name comes off as easy as it goes on. You're not, he searched for the polite version, you're not acquiring anything. I understand I'm acquiring $80 and a winter's start, Asa said. Don't recall asking for the moon. Della watched him say it. I watched her watch. She was looking for the lie in him, the slow-cooking kind, the kind that waits till you've signed and then turns into, well now, about that land, and I'll give her this. She was good at the looking. 11 months of being circled by Royce Holt teaches a woman to read a man's hands instead of his mouth. She didn't find the lie. That bothered her more than finding it would have. A clean man is harder to plan around than a crooked one. So they shook. And the next morning the preacher came, and I held the bay mare, and that was the wedding. 40 feet of dust between a woman who'd buried the love of her life and a man who'd agreed to be furniture for a season. When the words were done, Asa didn't reach for her, didn't even step toward her. He just took the pen Coyle held out, signed the paper on the porch rail, and then, this is the part I wrote in my tally book that night because it was the first crack, he took his hat off. Late. Awkward. Like he just remembered there was supposed to be a feeling somewhere in the room and he'd gone looking for his and come up with a hat instead. Della saw it too. Something crossed her face and got buried fast. Mr. Boone, she said, the bunkhouse roof leaks over the 3rd bunk, take the 2nd. Ma'am, he said. And that was the whole of the romance, as far as the county was ever told. Here's the thing the county didn't know, and it's the thing this whole story sits on top of like a house on a spring. The cold spring on the lower section wasn't only the reason Royce Holt wanted the land. It was the reason Della would have burned the deed before she let him have it. Up at that spring, in a stand of cottonwoods that stayed green when everything else went to bone, an Apache family had wintered for longer than the Mercers had owned a single acre of paper. Tom Mercer's father had made an arrangement with them, not a treaty, nothing the government would recognize, just 2 men and a handshake and a season's worth of watching each other not steal. The Mercer cattle drank the runoff. The family had the spring and the cottonwoods and a few horses, and the right to be left alone, which on the frontier is the only right anybody ever really fights about. The grandfather's name was Dasotahi. Though Tom had always called him by a shortened thing, the old man tolerated the way you tolerate a dog's name for you. He was past 70 and walked with a juniper staff, and had buried more of his own people than I'd ever met. His granddaughter, Nadie, was maybe 22, sharp as the spring water and twice as cold to strangers, and she ran most of what the old man could no longer run, the horses, the trading. The careful daily judgment of which white men were dangerous and which were merely useless. There were 2 younger children, a nephew with a hurt leg that had set wrong, and an old woman whose name I never earned. Tom had kept the handshake. When he died, Della kept it harder. She wasn't soft about it. Don't picture some tender lady carrying bread up a hill. Della Mercer kept that arrangement because Tom had, and because breaking it would mean handing Royce Holt a reason to ride up there with armed men and clear the elements. And because, this is the part that took me longest to see, she had decided, somewhere in those 11 months alone, that the only thing she still controlled in the entire world was her own word, and she was not going to spend it cheap. Nadie didn't trust the marriage. She came down to the ranch yard the third day, on a paint horse, and sat it while Della explained the arrangement in the flat trader's Spanish they shared. I caught about half. Asal was repairing the corral gate 20 feet off and pretended not to listen, which is how I knew he was listening hard. "A man for 90 days, Nadie said, or something near it. And then he is gone and the paper says the water is yours." "Yes," Della said. "And if he decides 90 days is not enough, if he decides the water is his?" Della didn't answer that, because there was no answer that wasn't a hope dressed as a fact. It was Asal who answered without turning around in Spanish rougher than theirs but plenty clear. "Then the woman who married him would shoot him in his sleep, and I'd have it coming." He said a rail. "I've met her, I believe her." Nadie looked at him a long moment. She didn't smile. I never once saw her smile at a white man in all of this. But something in the set of her shoulders changed from enemy to unknown quantity, which up there at the spring was a promotion most men never earned. She rode off. The old man, I heard later, asked her one question when she got back. "Does the new one feel the ground before he walks on it?" And Nadie said, "Yes, he does. I saw him do it the first day." And Dasotahi nodded like that settled something, though it would be months before any of us understood what. The first weeks went the way a hard bargain goes. Stiff, then bearable, then, against everybody's plans, good, in the small dangerous way that ruins arrangements. Asal worked. Lord, did he work. Not the showy kind a man does to impress a woman he's courting. There was none of that. He never courted. He barely looked at her direct for the first month. He worked the way a man works when work is the only language he's fluent in. He found the gap in the south fence that had been bleeding cattle into the Malpais for a year and we'd never caught. He doctored a steer with screwworm and didn't lose it. He rebuilt the well sweep so a woman could draw water without throwing her shoulder out. And when Della came out to find it done, he just said, "The old one was wrong," and walked off. And she stood there with her hand on the new sweep for a long time after. Me, I watched him and I kept my tally book honest. Some nights I wrote, "Boone, good day's work, no trouble," and some nights I wrote things I didn't have a column for. Like the night he found out the Mercer milk cow was the only thing the two Apache children would take milk from. Nadie brought them down for it. A quiet trade, eggs for milk. And Asal started, without telling Della, leaving the morning's first pail at the gate where the children could fetch it without having to come into a white man's yard and be looked at. He never mentioned it. I only knew because I'm up before the sun and I saw him do it, and I saw the older child, a girl, maybe 7, called Sin in the family, though I'm sure I'm mangling it, leave him a thing in trade on the third morning. A stone. Just a smooth red stone she'd picked because it was pretty. He put it in his pocket with his nails. I saw that too. There's a thing that happens between two stubborn people who agreed not to feel anything, and it is the slowest and most embarrassing thing in the world to watch. It happened over fence posts and supper plates and the particular way Asal would, when he thought no one saw, stop and look at the ranch house with an expression I can only call hungry, not for her exactly, not at first. Hungry for the having of a place. For a roof that was yours and a door you were allowed through. A drifter's hunger. The deepest kind there is. And it happened over the way Della stopped saying Mr. Boone and started saying Asal. And the night she did it the first time she caught herself and went red and stood up so fast she knocked her chair. And he had the grace, the rare animal grace, to pretend he hadn't heard. I want to be careful here, because this is where stories lie. Nobody fell in love in a thunderclap. There was no kiss in the rain. There was a widow who'd sworn off the whole notion of being known by a man, and a drifter who'd sworn off the whole notion of wanting anything he couldn't ride away from, and the two of them spent August accidentally building exactly the thing they'd both agreed in writing not to build. The county, of course, saw none of it. The county saw a sham marriage with a clock on it. Royce Holt saw the same. And Royce Holt, it turned out, had been doing his own arithmetic all summer. It started with the agent. Pelham, the soft, damp man, rode out at the end of August 3 weeks before the agreed inspection, and asked questions he had no business asking yet. Was Mr. Boone resident? Was the marriage bona fide? Were there, separate sleeping arrangements, because that would bear on the legitimacy of the claimed continuous household? You understand, and certain interested parties had raised the concern. Certain interested parties. He said it like a man reading from a card someone else wrote. Della answered everything flat and true and gave him nothing to hang her on, and Pelham rode off unsatisfied. And that night Asa cleaned his rifle longer than usual and finally said, to the rifle more than to us, "Holt's not waiting for the inspection. He's going to break it before it happens." "How?" I said. "3 ways. He didn't even have to think. That's the thing I noticed. He'd thought about it already. The way a man thinks who's seen this exact game played in some other valley with some other widow. He proves the marriage is false and the claim falls. Hard to do, we've not given him a thread. He proves the place can't be held, runs off stock, fires the grass, makes it look like the woman can't keep continuous improvement. And here he set the rifle down, he goes after the spring. Drives the family off, fouls the water or claims a complaint of depredations, brings men up the legal way with a paper, and once the lower section's a battlefield, Pelham condemns the whole patent as unfit for peaceful settlement, and Holt buys it off the territory for back taxes the next spring. Della had gone very still. "They've done nothing," she said. "The family, they've done nothing." "Doesn't matter what they've done," Asa said, and for the first time there was something old and tired and angry under his flat voice, something with a history I'd never get the whole of. "Matters what he can say they did and who'll believe him over them. And out here, ma'am, everyone will believe him over them." The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote asked its one question over and over. "So what do we do?" Della said. And Asa Boone, the temporary husband, the $80 man, the furniture with a clock on it, looked at her across the table. And I swear before God I watched a man decide to spend something he'd promised himself he'd never spend again. He said like the word cost him. He turned the red stone over in his fingers. "I'll think on it." He didn't say more. He went out to the second bunk under the roof that didn't leak. But I'd seen it. I'd seen the and I'd seen him not take it back. And I sat up that night and uncrossed the date in my tally book that I'd been so sure I'd get to cross, and under it I wrote 3 words I'm not proud of, because they were a guess and an old man shouldn't guess. The grass fire came on the 9th of September, a little after 2 in the morning, on the wind out of the south where it would do the most good for Royce Holt and the most ruin for everybody else. I smelled it before the dog barked. You live 60 years on dry country, your nose learns the difference between a cookfire and a coming death, and this was death, that low, fat, greasy smell of cured grass going up in a sheet. I was out of the bunk and hollering before my boots were on. Asa was already gone past me, shirt half on, running for the horses, and I heard him yell one word toward the house. "DLLA the spring." And then he was up on the gray bareback with a wet sack and a shovel, and gone south into the orange. Now here's where a lesser man, a man only protecting his $80, makes the choice that would have made sense. The fire was coming up from the south. The ranch house, the corrals, the year's hay, the deeded improvements that the claim itself depended on, those were to the west, downwind, directly in the path. The smart play, the play any hired hand makes, the play that protects the bargain, is you cut a fire break west of the house, and you save the buildings, and you let the south burn because the south is just open range. Except the south wasn't just open range. The south was the lower section, the cold spring, the cottonwoods, the family. Asa rode south. He rode away from the buildings whose survival was the whole point of the 90 days, away from the improvements the agent would inspect, away from the only thing that made the claim worth holding, and towards 7 people who had no paper, no claim, no vote, and no value at all in the eyes of any court that would ever judge this. He rode toward the people the fire was meant to flush out. I figured it out a half-second behind him, and I went south too, on the bay, cussing my old bones the whole way. Della, and I'll never stop seeing this, Della did the impossible thing. She split the difference no sane person could split. She sent the boy from town who slept in the loft, young Paretta, west to throw a break in front of the buildings, and she rode south after us with every wet sack in the house, because she had made an arrangement with that family, and she was not going to let her own salvation be bought with their burning. Up at the spring it was already chaos lit orange. Nadie had the horses out and the 2 children up behind her and the old woman moving slow with a bundle, but the fire had jumped the wash faster than a body could run, and the way out east was a wall of flame, and the way back to the water was the only chance, and the old man, Dasodahi, was not at the spring. He'd gone up the slope, to the rocks, to a thing I didn't understand then and barely do now, a place the family kept that mattered more to them than their own skins, the way some things do. And Nadie was screaming his name and trying to hold the horses and keep the children from bolting, all at once, and losing. Asa took it in one look. I watched him take it. And then he did the math out loud, fast, the way a man does when there's no time to be gentle about it. The cut bank, the wet sand, put them in the spring, all of them. Sit them in the water and put the wet sacks over their heads, the fire will roll over the top, Geo. He was off the gray and pulling the bundle from the old woman's arms to carry her himself. Holly's horses pull him down the wash is bare, Geo. Della, and here he stopped half a second, and I will tell you the look that passed between them was the marriage, the whole of it, realer than the preacher, realer than the paper. Della, the old man's up top. I'm going up if I'm not back. You'll be back, she said. If I'm not. You'll be back, Asa Boone. It came out of her like a command and a prayer welded together, and he heard the second name and he almost said something. And then the fire ate the moment and he turned and went up into the worst of it after a 70-year-old Apache man who had never once been kind to him, who had no reason to expect saving from a white man, who couldn't have done one single thing to repay it. That's the morally heavy part. People who have never been near a fire think the heavy choice is dramatic. It isn't. It's just up when every cell in your body screams down. It's spending the one currency you can't earn back, your own breathing time, on a person who can't pay you in anything but the fact of being a person. We got the children in the water. Nadie held the littlest one's face above the surface with the wet sack over them both and her own back to the heat, and I have never in my life seen anything braver, and I have seen brave things. I dragged the horses down the bare wash and they screamed, and I screamed back and we made it. Della stood waist-deep in the spring with the old woman in her arms, and her eyes on the slope where the orange had closed up behind 2 men. The fire rolled over. It took maybe 90 seconds. It felt like a winter. And then it was past, gone roaring north and west toward where it would meet young Paretta's fire break in the buildings, and the spring sat in a black world steaming, and the cottonwoods were scorched but standing because cottonwoods near water are stubborn, and out of the smoke up the slope came 2 shapes leaning on each other. Asa, with his eyebrows gone and his shirt smoking and a burn on his forearm, I'd be doctoring for 3 weeks. And Dasodahi, the old man, alive, carrying against his chest the thing he'd gone up for, a deerskin bundle, soot black, that I never saw the inside of and never asked to. The old man didn't thank him, understand that. He didn't say one word. He looked at Asa a long moment in the steaming dark, and then he reached out with one shaking old hand and pressed it flat against the younger man's chest, over the heart, and held it there. And Asa stood and let him. And that was the whole of it, and it was bigger than any words either of them had. Nady came up out of the water with the children and stood beside her grandfather, and she looked at Asa, and her face was doing something I'd never seen it do for a white man, and she said one sentence in English, which I hadn't even known she had. She said, "Now you know our word for it." And Asa burned, shaking, eyebrows gone. The $80 man laughed, just once, a cracked, smoke-ruined sound, and he said, "Reckon I do." The buildings held. Just. Parada's break and the wind shifting at dawn saved the house and most of the hay. We lost a stretch of fence and one shed and a year off my heart. By daylight the valley was a black and white photograph of itself, and we were all alive, which on the morning after a fire is the only thing you're allowed to ask for. Royce Holt rode over before noon. Of course he did. He came with 2 of his men and a face arranged into neighborly concern, and he sat his horse in the burned yard and said the most chilling thing a man can say, which is true words with a buried knife in them. "Terrible thing, a grass fire, terrible. You see how it is out here, Mrs. Mercer. A place needs managing, needs men and money and the kind of standing that keeps the territory's attention friendly." He looked at the black slope to the south. "I heard there was a pash up at the spring when it started. Folks'll wonder how a fire starts on a still night. Folks'll talk. The agent'll hear the talk." There it was, the whole game, laid on the table like a winning hand he wanted us to see. He'd started the fire, I'd stake my soul on it, though we never proved it, and now he was going to blame the family for it. Depredations. A complaint to the agent. The lower section condemned as unfit for peaceful settlement, the family driven off or worse, and Royce Holt buying the steaming ruin for back taxes come spring. Exactly the third way Asa had named at the table. He'd called it weeks before, like a man reading a book he'd read in some other valley. And then Holt played the card I didn't see coming. He swung down off his horse, walked over to where Asa stood by the well, and lowered his voice to something almost kind. "You're a sensible man, Boone. I've watched you. You're not from here, you don't owe this dirt anything, and he made a show of counting, 14 days. Your paper marriage is up and you're a free man with $80 and a long winter. That's a hard way to ride." He let it sit. "I could use a man who knows fire, knows the country, a man who could tell the agent what he saw the night of the fire, tell him plain. A pash at the spring, the fire starting up from there, the woman in over her head. A man who told it that way." Holt smiled. "That man wouldn't ride out with $80. That man would ride out with 800, and my goodwill, and a clean record, and a foreman's job at the bar cross if he wanted to set down roots somewhere with a future. $800, a job, roots, a future. Everything a drifter is hungry for, everything I'd watched Asa look at the ranch house wanting, all of it offered free and clean, and all it cost was a lie that would burn 7 people off the only land they had." I stopped breathing. I won't pretend I didn't, because here's the truth an honest man tells. I didn't know what he'd do. I'd written he's going to stay in my book, but staying is cheap when nobody's paying you to leave. This was $800 and a future against a handshake he'd only inherited, and a family that couldn't pay him, and a woman he'd agreed in writing not to love. Asa was quiet a long time. He looked at the burned slope. He looked at the well sweep he'd rebuilt so a woman wouldn't throw her shoulder. He put his hand in his pocket, and I knew without seeing that he was turning over the red stone the little girl had traded him for the milk. "That's a real generous offer, Mr. Holt," he said. And Holt smiled because he'd heard a yes coming. We all heard it coming. Even Della, standing on the porch, went pale because she heard it too, the sound of a man about to be sensible. "I'll need to think on it," Asa said. "Man be a fool not to." Holt nodded, satisfied. "You think on it. Inspections in 14 days. I'll need your word before then." He mounted up. "Smart man," he said, and rode out with his 2 men, leaving that offer sitting in the burned yard like a live coal. Asa watched him go. His face told me nothing. It told Della nothing, and she'd gotten good at faces. That night she came out to the bunkhouse. First time in 90 days she'd crossed that yard after dark, and I pretended to be asleep, which is the kindest thing an old man can do, and I heard them talking low. "Are you going to take it?" she said. Not a question, really, bracing for it. $800, Asa said. "A foreman's job, roots." A long pause. Lot of money to a man with 80. "Are you going to take it?" And he didn't answer her, that's the thing. He didn't say no. He let the silence sit, and I heard her stand up after a while and walk back across the yard, and I heard the house door close, and I lay there in the dark with my nail in my fingers thinking I was wrong. I was wrong. He's going to take it, of course he's going to take it. What did I expect? In the morning, Asa was gone. His bunk was empty, his saddlebags gone, the gray gone from the corral. No note. Della stood in the doorway with her face shut like a bank vault, and Nady, who'd come down at dawn for the milk, looked at the empty corral and then at Della and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The white man had ridden off to take the white man's money. The oldest story on the frontier. The only ending any of us should have expected. I crossed out "he's going to stay" in my tally book. I pressed so hard I tore the page. 11 days to the inspection. The family marked for ruin. A widow who'd let herself feel one thing in 11 months and gotten it thrown back in her face. And somewhere on the road north, a sensible man riding to tell a profitable lie. That's where the second part ends, because that's where I thought the whole thing ended. I'm an old man and I've been wrong exactly once on purpose, and I want you to feel how wrong I was, the way I felt it, sick and certain, and sure I'd watched the last good thing leave the valley on a gray horse before sunup. I hadn't, but I had no way of knowing that yet, and neither did Della, and neither, I think, did Royce Holt, which is the only part of this whole business that still makes me smile. I'll tell you what those 6 days were like, because the shock doesn't mean anything if you don't first sit in the silence the way we sat in it. Della didn't cry. I never once saw that woman cry, not at Tom's grave, not in the fire, not now. She did something harder to watch. She got efficient. She got up before me and worked past me and made lists and rode the fence line and arranged what little defense a widow can arrange against a lie. And she did it all with her face shut. And the only tell was that she stopped saying his name, even by accident, the way she'd started saying it by accident in August. Nady kept coming for the milk. She and Della had moved past needing many words. One morning Nady said in her careful English, "My grandfather says the new one will come back." And Della said flat, "Your grandfather is kind." And Nady said, "My grandfather is not kind. He is right. It is different." And Della didn't answer, but I saw her hands go still on the milk pail for just a moment. Holt rode over twice, pressing for the agent's date, smug as a cat, certain his sensible man was off arranging the testimony that would finish us. He didn't know Asa was gone. He thought the silence was the sound of a deal getting made. On the 6th night, the night before the inspection, a wagon came up the road in the dark. Not the gray. A wagon hired with a driver from Tucson and a second man beside him in a town suit, and Asa Boone on the gray riding alongside it, filthy, hollow-eyed, 6 days unshaven, looking like a man who'd ridden to Tucson and back without sleeping, because that is exactly what he had done. Della came out on the porch with the shotgun, not pointed, just there, a woman who'd been left once already that week and was done being surprised. "You forgot something," she said, cold as the spring. "Your $80, I'll fetch it. Then you can go back to wherever you've been earning your 800. And Asa got down off the gray slow, like every bone hurt, and he didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't beg. He just held up a leather satchel of papers, and he said the thing that turned the whole world over. "I didn't go to Holt." His voice was wrecked from no sleep and old smoke. "I went to Tucson, to the lawyer, and to the land office, the real one, not Pelham." He climbed the porch steps. "Della, listen. There was a thing I knew that I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure and I didn't want to give you a hope I couldn't stand on." He opened the satchel. Tom's father, the handshake with the old man at the spring. It wasn't only a handshake. I came closer. So did Della against her own will. Old Mercer filed something, Asas said. 40 years back, before the territory tightened up. He filed a reservation of use on the spring section, a recorded easement witnessed, recognizing the family's right to the water and the cottonwoods in perpetuity, binding on any future pat. It's buried in the old Spanish grant records that the new agents never read because they can't read the old hand. Tom never knew it was there. Pelham doesn't know it's there. Holt sure as hell doesn't know it's there. He pulled out a certified copy, sealed, the territorial seal pressed deep in the wax. I went and dug it up. 6 days in dusty rooms with a clerk I had to bribe with my $80 and then some. It's real, it's recorded. It's theirs and it's been theirs the whole time, and no complaint of depredations, no condemnation, no back taxes scheme can touch a recorded perpetual easement. Holt can't take the spring. Nobody can take the spring, not from them, not ever. Della stared at the seal in the wax like it might vanish. And there's this, Asas said, and his voice changed, got rough in a different place. He pulled out a second paper. The dissolution, our papers, the ones that end the 90 days. He held them up. And then while we all watched, he tore them in half. I'm not signing these. The marriage holds the claim now, the claim's clean, the easement's filed, the family's safe. You keep the lower section free and clear, and you don't need a temporary husband for one more day of it. The 90 days did their job. You're done with me. You can throw me off this place tonight and you'll lose nothing. The land is yours. The law is yours. You don't need my name anymore. He set the torn dissolution papers on the porch rail. The same rail he'd signed the marriage paper on 90 days back, with his hat on too late. So I'm not staying because you need me to, he said. There's the only honest reason left. He stopped. The man who'd run up into a fire couldn't get the next words out, and that's how I knew they were the true ones. I'm asking to stay because I want to, because I felt the ground the first day and it felt like the only ground I ever wanted to stand on, because you said my name in August and I've been a dead man walking ever since, trying not to want to hear it again. I'm not asking you to want it back. I know what you buried. I'm just, he ran out. I had to come tell you the truth before I let you decide, that's all. That's the whole of it. And then he did the thing that shocked everyone, shocked the county for a year, shocked Holt clean off his land within 2 when the easement got recorded loud and public, and the Bar Cross's whole northern scheme fell apart in court. Shocked me, an old man who thought he'd seen the Shapes men come in. He took the certified easement, the document he'd nearly killed his $80 and 6 days of his life to dig out of the ground, and he didn't keep it as leverage, didn't hold it over Della, didn't use it to make himself necessary. He folded it, and he turned to where Nadie stood at the edge of the firelight. She'd come down in the dark when she heard the wagon, the way she always knew when something was happening, and he walked over and put it in her hands. That belongs to your grandfather, he said. Not to me, not to the bank, not to the territory. It's been yours 40 years. Somebody should have given it to you a long time ago. Nutta looked at the seal. She looked at the white man, filthy and wrecked and standing there having just handed a powerless family the one piece of paper that made them, for the first time in 2 generations, unremovable by any law in the territory. And Nutta, who I had never once seen smile at a white man, did not smile. She did something better. She turned and called up the dark slope in her own language, 3 words I didn't understand, and out of the night came the old man, Desutaha, leaning on his juniper staff, who must have walked all the way down because he knew, the way he'd known the new one would come back. And Nutta put the paper in her grandfather's hands and spoke to him low and fast, and the old man held the document a long time, running his thumb over the wax seal he couldn't read. And then he looked up at Ussa across the firelit yard. And he said the word, out loud, in his own tongue, the word Nutta had told Ussa he'd know after the fire, the family's word for the thing a man does when he spends what he can't get back, on people who can't pay him, for no reason but that it's the spending that makes him a man. I never learned what the word was. I asked Nutta once, years later, and she said an old man's word isn't mine to carry, and she was right, and I let it go. But I saw what it did. I saw it land on us a boon like the old man's hand had landed on his chest in the steam after the fire, flat over the heart and hold there. Della was crying. First and only time. Standing on the porch with the shotgun forgotten in the crook of her arm and the torn dissolution papers on the rail, and the man she'd married for 90 days standing in the firelight having just given away the only leverage he'd ever have. She put her free hand over her mouth, and she cried, silent, the way people cry when a thing they buried turns out not to be dead. She didn't run to him. That's not who she was, and this isn't that kind of story. She set the shotgun against the wall. She picked up the 2 torn halves of the dissolution paper off the rail. She walked down the steps, across the yard, into the firelight, and she stood in front of Ussa Boone, close, the way she had not stood close to any man in 11 months and 11 days, and she held up the 2 torn halves so he could see them. "You tore these," she said. Her voice was wrecked too now. "That's a fool thing to do with a legal document, Mr. Boone. What if I'd wanted you gone?" "Then I'd have had it coming," he said, "same as the first day." And she looked at him a long moment, the longest moment, the whole 90 days folded up inside it, the wedding with 40 feet of dust between them, the well sweep, the milk pail at the gate, the wee he didn't take back, the fire, the 6 days she thought he'd betrayed her, all of it. And she let the 2 torn halves of the paper fall out of her hand into the dirt. That's where I stop. I know how stories are supposed to end. I know you want the kiss, the I love you, the morning after, the wedding that was real this time, the children, the years. I know it's all there. I lived the years. I rocked the children. I'm buried not 50 feet from both of them now in the little ground above the cold spring. And the spring still runs. And Nutta's grandchildren still water their horses there under cottonwoods that no law in this country can touch. Because of a piece of paper a drifter dug out of the dirt with the last of his $80.